The town of Saint-Étienne in Louisiana woke up to the sound of church bells every Sunday morning. The population of 7,000 knew each other, if not personally, then by reputation, and news spread faster than the vapors from the swamps surrounding the town. At the center of community life stood Grace Baptist Church, a snow-white building with a tall spire rising above oak trees covered with Spanish moss. It was here, 3 months ago, on the first Saturday in May, that a wedding took place that was still the talk of the town. David Hartwell, a 28-year-old pastor, married Sarah Mitchell, a 26-year-old nurse from the local clinic. The ceremony was flawless, from the bride's snow-white dress to the groom's solemn words about the sanctity of marriage before God. David Hartwell had come to St. Etienne 2 years ago, a young seminary graduate with burning eyes and unshakable faith. Tall, thin, with neatly trimmed dark hair and a soft voice, he quickly won the hearts of the congregation. His sermons on family values, moral purity, and serving God attracted not only regular members of the community, but also young families from neighboring areas. In 2 years, the congregation nearly doubled in size. "Pastor David understands what it means to live by God's commandments in today's world," said Eleanor Hartwell, the pastor's 55-year-old mother, who moved to St. Stephen's shortly after her son. Eleanor, a former Sunday school teacher, quickly rose to an influential position on the Women's Council. Her voice was often decisive in church matters, and her approval could make or break a reputation in the community. Sarah Mitchell had been working as a nurse at Dr. Michael Green's clinic for 4 years. She had moved to Saint-Étienne from Baton Rouge after graduating from nursing school, officially in search of a quiet life in a small town. But those who knew her well suspected that she was running from something in her past. Sarah was quiet, hard-working, always ready to help patients, but rarely spoke about her life before coming to town. David and Sarah met a year ago under tragic circumstances. 80-year-old Mrs. Thibodeau, one of the oldest parishioners, was rushed to the hospital with a heart attack. David came to give her last rites, and Sarah was on duty that night. They spent several hours at the dying woman's bedside, praying and holding her hands. Mrs. Thibodeau passed away at dawn, but the way David and Sarah supported each other during those difficult hours laid the foundation for their relationship. They were made for each other, people in town said. David found in Sarah a quiet, devoted companion who shared his faith and was willing to support his ministry. Sarah seemed to find in David the protection and purpose she had been lacking. Their courtship lasted 8 months, long enough to observe propriety, but not long enough to give rise to gossip. The wedding was the event of the year. The church was decorated with white lilies and greenery, and it smelled of magnolias and candle wax. Sarah looked like the embodiment of innocence in the simple but elegant dress she had chosen with Eleanor. David, in a new black suit, read his vows with such sincerity that many of the guests wept. The senior pastor from the neighboring parish, who married the couple, spoke of them as a beacon of Christian values for the younger generation. After the wedding, the newlyweds settled in a small house next to the church, a white wooden structure with a porch, surrounded by camellias and azaleas. The house was a gift from the community, which had raised money especially for the young pastor. Eleanor helped furnish the house, choosing furniture and curtains, insisting that the pastor's house should be an example to everyone. Sarah easily slipped into the role of pastor's wife. She participated in the Women's Council, helped organize charity events, and played the piano during Sunday services. Her medical knowledge proved useful when visiting sick parishioners. It seemed that she had found her calling in serving alongside her husband. Dr. Michael Green, a 45-year-old physician who ran the only clinic in town, knew Sarah better than anyone else. He had come to St. Etienne 15 years ago after his divorce, seeking solitude in a quiet town. A tall, graying man with tired eyes, he was respected as a professional, but kept his distance from the town's church life. That didn't prevent him from maintaining a good relationship with the pastor. They sometimes met while visiting the sick, and David appreciated the doctor's dedication to his work. But Dr. Green noticed something that others didn't. A shadow sometimes crossed Sarah's eyes, especially when the conversation turned to her work at the clinic. She was an excellent nurse, but she performed some procedures with visible tension. When patients asked questions about family planning or sensitive women's issues, Sarah became particularly reserved, referring such cases to other nurses. The first months of marriage seemed idyllic. David and Sarah appeared at all church events, holding hands and smiling. David often mentioned his wife in his sermons as an example of Christian womanhood. Sarah supported him, nodding from the front row, where she always sat next to Eleanor. "They show us all what a Christian marriage should look like," said Mrs. Bourdieu, chairwoman of the Women's Council and one of the most influential figures in the community. "Young people can take their example." However, there were those who noticed the small details. Sarah sometimes looked tired, despite her youth. During long church meetings, she would stare at a single point, as if her mind were somewhere far away. When David talked about the importance of honesty in marriage or that spouses should have no secrets from each other, Sarah would tense up slightly. Eleanor, with her keen maternal instinct, also noticed these moments. She chalked them up to natural adjustment to a new role, but sometimes wondered if she knew her daughter-in-law well enough. Sarah was polite and tried to please, but there was something unapproachable about her, some inner territory where she let no one in. In August, 3 months after the wedding, this idyllic picture began to crack. Sarah started receiving strange phone calls. They came late at night or early in the morning, and when she picked up the phone, there was silence for a few seconds before the caller hung up. At first it happened once a week, then more often. "It's probably a wrong number," David would say when Sarah mentioned it. But he noticed how she flinched every time the phone rang and how tensely she listened before answering. Dr. Green also began to behave strangely around Sarah. He had always treated her like a trusted colleague, almost like a daughter. Now there was a look of concern in his eyes, and he tried not to be alone with her. When David came to the clinic to visit sick parishioners, Dr. Green seemed particularly tense. Sarah herself began to change imperceptibly but constantly. She became even more silent, often lost in thought in the middle of a conversation. At night, David heard her tossing and turning in bed, and several times he woke up to the sound of her crying softly, thinking he was asleep. "What's wrong?" he asked her one night as he held her in the darkness of their bedroom. "Nothing, honey. I'm just tired. Work, church, I need time to get used to everything," Sarah replied, snuggling closer to him. But David sensed that she wasn't telling him the whole truth. In a small town where everyone knew each other, such changes did not go unnoticed. People began to whisper. Some explained Sarah's changes as natural difficulties in adjusting to her role as a pastor's wife. Others made more sinister assumptions about possible marital problems or hidden illnesses. Eleanor decided to take control of the situation. She began to visit the young couple more often, under the pretext of helping with the housework or preparing for church events. Her presence gave Sarah another reason to be tense, but Eleanor was determined to get to the bottom of the matter and protect her son's reputation. September brought the first breath of autumn to Saint-Étienne. The air became less humid, and the morning chill gave hope for an end to the exhausting summer. But in the Hartwell home, the atmosphere was becoming increasingly tense. The phone calls became more frequent. Now they came almost every day, sometimes several times a day. Sarah stopped answering the phone in David's presence, letting the answering machine take the calls. When she did pick up the phone and hear the familiar silence, her face paled and her hands began to tremble. "Sarah, we need to call the police," David said one evening when the phone rang for the third time in an hour. "This is stalking." "No," she replied sharply, surprising him with the force of her reaction. "I mean, no, it'll pass. It's probably just someone's stupid prank." But David saw the fear in her eyes. It wasn't annoyance at the incessant calls, but genuine, deep fear, as if these silent calls carried a threat that only she could understand. At Dr. Green's clinic, the situation was becoming even stranger. Michael Green, usually calm and professional, began to avoid eye contact with Sarah. He assigned her only routine tasks, taking blood pressure, preparing instruments, filing patient charts. When difficult cases or patients with sensitive issues came in, he called Mary LeBlanc, the second nurse who worked at the clinic part-time. "Dr. Green has been acting strangely lately," Mary complained to Sarah during their lunch break. "He used to trust you completely with difficult procedures, but now it's as if he's afraid to let you near him." Sarah just shrugged, but inside she felt sick. She knew the reason for the doctor's change in behavior, and that reason tormented her every night. Meanwhile, rumors began to spread around town. Mrs. Bourdieu, the chairwoman of the Women's Council, noticed that the young Mrs. Hartwell looked somewhat lost during the last church services. Tom Landry, who worked at the post office, said he had seen Sarah throw away unopened letters twice without even looking at them. Maybe they're having money problems? Suggested Mrs. Tremblay, the local shopkeeper. Or is she ill? She looks very pale. Eleanor Hartwell heard all the talk and felt her anxiety growing. Her son's reputation was everything to her, and any shadow cast on his marriage could damage his ministry. She decided to take action. One Thursday, Eleanor went to the young couple's house to help with the cleaning. Sarah was at work, and Eleanor was left alone with her son. "David, I'm worried about Sarah," she began, dusting the chest of drawers in the living room. "She doesn't look happy, and people are starting to notice." David looked up from the sermon he was writing at the kitchen table. "What do you mean?" "She's lost weight. She always looks worried. And those phone calls." Eleanor paused, studying her son's face. "You told me about the phone calls." David put down his pen. "Yes, but it's just an annoying misunderstanding. Someone has the wrong number." "Every day? Several times a day?" Eleanor sat down opposite her son. "David, there should be no secrets in a marriage, especially in a pastor's marriage. What isn't she telling you?" This question had been haunting David for several weeks. He loved Sarah, but he was beginning to realize that he knew surprisingly little about her. Her past before she came to Saint Etienne remained a mystery. She said she hadn't had any serious relationships in Baton Rouge, that her parents were dead, and that she had almost no relatives left. But now this lack of detail seemed suspicious. "I've tried asking her," he admitted to his mother, "but she shuts down. She says the past doesn't matter, that only our future together is important." "The past is always important, David, especially for a pastor's wife." Eleanor took her son's hand. "Maybe you should talk to Dr. Green? He's known her longer than anyone here." That same evening, David decided to talk to Sarah. They sat on the porch, watching the sun set over the marshy plain. The air was filled with the scent of jasmine and the distant croaking of frogs. "Sarah, I want you to know that you can tell me anything," he began, taking her hand in his. "We're husband and wife. There shouldn't be any walls between us." Sarah tensed. "What are you talking about?" "About those phone calls. About how you've become so distant. About Dr. Green acting strange when we meet." David turned to her. "What happened in your past? What are you hiding?" For a moment, it seemed as if Sarah was ready to tell him everything. Her lips trembled and her eyes glistened with tears. But then she covered her face with her hands and shook her head. "Nothing special, David. Just difficult times. Everyone makes mistakes when they're young. I don't want my past to cast a shadow on your ministry." "What mistakes?" he insisted. "Sarah, we can overcome anything if we're honest with each other." But she just got up and went into the house, leaving him alone with his growing anxiety. The next day, David decided to talk to Dr. Green. He came to the clinic under the pretext of visiting old Mr. Boutreau, who was lying in bed with pneumonia. After the patient fell asleep, David found the doctor in his office. "Dr. Green, can we talk in private?" Michael Green looked up from the medical charts, and David saw alarm in his eyes. "Of course, Pastor, have a seat." "It's about Sarah," David began, sitting down in the chair across from the desk. "I'm worried about her. She's been different since we got married, and I feel like it has something to do with her past." Dr. Green froze, his hands resting on the desk, clenched into fists. "Different in what way?" "She's become withdrawn, tense. She's been getting strange phone calls and—" David paused. "I've noticed that you've been different with her too. You used to trust her with your most difficult patients, but now—" "Pastor Hartwell." Dr. Green stood up and walked over to the window, his back to David. "There are professional matters I cannot discuss. Doctor-patient confidentiality." "We're talking about my wife. That's why I can't say anything." The doctor turned around, and David saw the struggle on his face. "But I will tell you one thing. Sarah is a good woman. She has made choices that many would consider difficult, but she's a good woman." "What choices?" Dr. Green was silent for a long time, looking out the window at the street where the ordinary residents of Saint Etienne went about their ordinary lives. "Pastor, What if you found out something about Sarah's past that conflicted with your beliefs? What would you do? David frowned. What do you mean? Just hypothetically. What if someone you loved had once done something you considered wrong, but they did it out of compassion, out of a desire to help? I don't know. I guess it would depend on what it was. David paused, sensing that the conversation was taking a dangerous turn. Doctor, what do you know about Sarah? But Michael Green already regretted his words. Nothing specific, Pastor. Just give her time. And remember, we are all sinners and in need of forgiveness. David left the clinic even more troubled. The doctor's words sounded like a warning, but about what? That evening at dinner, Sarah was particularly quiet. She barely touched the roast chicken and vegetables she had prepared and caught her husband's searching gaze several times. Did you talk to Dr. Green? She asked suddenly. David was surprised. How did you know? He looked at me differently this afternoon, as if he felt sorry for me. Sarah put down her fork. What did he say to you? Nothing specific, just that you're a good woman, but you've made some difficult choices in your past. David leaned across the table. Sarah, please, what choices? She stood up from the table so abruptly that she knocked over a glass of water. The liquid spilled onto the tablecloth, but Sarah didn't notice. I can't, David. You wouldn't understand. You'll never understand. Her voice trembled. You live in a world where everything is black or white, good or bad. Real life isn't like that. What are you talking about? About how sometimes you have to do what you think is wrong to help someone who is suffering. About how sometimes compassion is more important than rules. Tears rolled down her cheeks. And about how some people will never understand that because they've never had to make that choice. She ran out of the kitchen, leaving David completely bewildered. A few minutes later, he heard the bedroom door slam, followed by muffled sobs. David cleared the table and sat in the living room for a long time, thinking about his wife's words. What could she have meant? What decisions in her past had been so difficult that she couldn't talk about them? Around midnight, the phone rang. David picked up the receiver, ready to yell at another silent caller, but heard a woman's voice. Tell Sarah that Jessica remembers. Tell her we all remember what she did at Dr. Riley's clinic. David felt a chill run down his spine. Who is this? What do you mean? But the phone was already ringing. He slowly climbed the stairs to the bedroom. The door was locked, for the first time in all the months of their marriage. He knocked softly. Sarah? Sarah, we need to talk. Please, David, not now, came a muffled voice. Tomorrow. We'll talk tomorrow. But David knew that tomorrow she would find another way to avoid the conversation. The name Dr. Riley and the words she was at the clinic kept running through his head. What kind of work did she do in Baton Rouge? And why did someone think it was so important to call years later? He spent the night in the guest room, tormented by questions and gradually realizing that his perfect marriage was built on a lie. Sarah was hiding something significant from him, something that could destroy not only their relationship, but also his reputation as a pastor. October arrived in St. Etienne with cool mornings and the first yellow leaves on the oak trees. But in the Hartwell home, the crispness of autumn couldn't dispel the atmosphere of growing tension. After Jessica's phone call, David couldn't settle down, and Sarah became increasingly withdrawn and frightened. David spent a sleepless night analyzing every word of the mysterious caller. Dr. Riley's clinic was stuck in his head like a splinter. The next morning, while Sarah was in the shower, he quietly went into their bedroom and began searching through her things for any clues about her past. Deep in the closet, under a stack of old photographs, he found an envelope with documents. Inside were employment records, letters of recommendation, and a certificate of completion for a specialized course in family planning and reproductive health. The document was issued by the Women's Health Clinic in Baton Rouge, and the chief physician was Dr. Edward Riley. David felt his heart beat faster. Family planning. In conservative religious circles, this term was often a euphemism for more controversial procedures. Really? What are you doing? David turned and saw Sarah in the doorway. Her face was pale and her eyes were filled with horror. Sarah, what is that? He held up the certificate. She rushed toward him and tried to grab the document, but David pulled away. Give it to me. You have no right to go through my things." "I have no right? I'm your husband." David studied the document. "Family planning specialist, Sarah, what exactly were you doing at that clinic?" Sarah sank to the edge of the bed, covering her face with her hands. Her shoulders shook. "Please, David, don't ask. Just don't ask." "No, now I have to know the truth." He sat down next to her but didn't touch her. "Jessica called last night. She said she remembers what you were doing at Dr. Riley's clinic." "Sarah, for God's sake, what's going on?" A long silence filled the room. Outside the window, the usual morning sounds of the city could be heard: dogs barking, cars honking, distant voices. But in their bedroom, time seemed to stand still. "I was helping women," Sarah finally whispered, without looking up. "Women who had nowhere else to turn. What kind of women? How exactly did you help them?" Sarah looked up at him, her eyes full of tears and despair. "You know the answer, David. Deep down, you already understand. That's why you're afraid to ask." David felt the world begin to crumble around him. "Tell me yourself." "I assisted with abortions." The words sounded like a death sentence. 3 years. "I worked at a clinic that helped women in difficult situations." David slowly stood up, moving away from the bed. The certificate fell from his hands onto the floor. "Abortions," he said. "You killed children." "No!" Sarah jumped up. "That's not true. We helped women who couldn't help themselves, who were in desperate situations, teenagers who had been raped, women whose children were terminally ill, mothers who would have died in childbirth." "That's murder, Sarah," David's voice broke. "It doesn't matter what the circumstances were. You participated in the murder of innocent babies." "They weren't murders." Tears rolled down her cheeks. "They were acts of mercy. You didn't see those women, David. You didn't see their pain, their despair. 16-year-old girls raped by their own stepfathers, mothers of 4 children who wouldn't have survived a 5th pregnancy. Women who knew their children would be born only to suffer and die." "Enough!" David covered his ears. "I don't want to hear this." "But you have to understand. The world isn't black and white like your sermons. Sometimes you have to choose between bad and worse." David looked at her with an expression Sarah had never seen before. It wasn't anger in his eyes, but something worse. Disgust. "You've been lying to me from the beginning," he said quietly. "All this time, you've been lying." "I wasn't lying, I just didn't tell you." "That's the same thing." He began to pace the room. "My God, Sarah, I'm a pastor. My life, my ministry is based on protecting life, on the sanctity of human existence. And I was trying to help people the only way I knew how. By killing children, by saving women." Their screams probably echoed throughout the house, but neither of them thought about that. Years of hidden truth poured out with all the pain that had built up. David stopped and turned his back to her. His voice became cold and formal. "How many?" "What? How many were there? How many children did you help kill?" Sarah closed her eyes. "I didn't count. Count now. David, please. Count." She took a deep breath. Maybe 100, in 3 years." David sank into the chair by the window as if his legs had given way. 100 children, he repeated. "My wife helped kill 100 children." "They weren't children, David. They were—" "Don't you dare!" he exploded. "Don't you dare rationalize it. You know what I think about it. You know what the Bible says." "The Bible says many things, David. It also says about mercy and compassion and not judging others. And that murder is a sin." They stared at each other across the room, and Sarah realized that the man she loved now saw her as a monster. And David realized that the woman he had considered the embodiment of Christian virtue was the person he believed to be a murderer. The phone rang, breaking the silence. This time, David answered it himself. "Hello?" "He knows now, doesn't he?" a mocking female voice said. "This is Jessica Tremblay. Does Sarah remember my daughter Emily?" David looked at his wife. "Sarah, who is Emily Tremblay?" Sarah's face turned white as a sheet. "Hang up, David, please." "He won't hang up," the voice on the other end continued, "because he wants to know the truth. Emily was my 17-year-old daughter. Your precious wife convinced her that abortion was the best option. She said it would be quick and easy." "That's not true," Sarah screamed. "I didn't convince anyone, I just what?" David didn't take the phone away from his ear. She held my daughter's hand while she was being killed, Jessica continued. And then there were complications. Emily bled to death. She died 2 days later in intensive care. David felt his legs give way. What? Your wife is a double murderer, Pastor. She killed my grandson and my daughter, and I won't let her hide in your little town and play the saint. The phone fell from David's hands. Sarah rushed to the phone. Jessica, please listen to me. No! You listen to me, Sarah Mitchell. I know where you live. I know you married a pastor and pretend to be a good Christian, but I won't let you forget what you did. Emily made her own decision. I didn't force her. You could have talked her out of it. You could have told her there were other options. I had no right. It was her choice. And now she's dead. The scream on the phone was full of pain. My little girl is dead, and you're living happily. Sarah hung up the phone with trembling hands and turned to her husband. David sat in his chair, staring at the floor. David, please listen to my side of the story. Your side? He looked up at her. What side could a murderer have? I'm not a murderer. Emily died from complications that no one could have foreseen. It was an accident. An accident that wouldn't have happened if you hadn't helped her kill her child. She was 17. She was raped by her own uncle. She wanted to kill herself. Then you should have helped her find another way out. Talk to a psychologist, a priest. Put the baby up for adoption. You think we didn't offer alternatives? But she was a minor, traumatized, scared. Her family had disowned her. She had no one. She had you. You could have guided her to God, helped her find strength. Sarah laughed bitterly. To God? To the same God who allowed her to be raped? To the same God before whom her own mother called her a whore? Don't blaspheme. I'm not blaspheming. I'm telling the truth. Where was your God when a 35-year-old man raped a child? Where was he when her parents kicked her out of the house? David stood up and walked over to the window. Outside, Saint Etienne went about its daily life. People went to work. Children played in the yards. Life went on. And here, in their bedroom, the world they had tried to build together was falling apart. I can't live with this, he said without turning around. What exactly? The fact that my wife is a murderer. The fact that she lied to me for months. The fact that my ministry, my reputation, everything I believe in is now in jeopardy. David, I'm the same woman you fell in love with. No! He turned abruptly. No, you're not! That woman was an illusion, a lie! I fell in love with a fantasy! Sarah sank down onto the bed. What now? David stared at her for a long time. Love and disgust, loyalty and betrayal fought in his eyes. I don't know, he said finally. Honestly, I don't know. At that moment, there was a knock at the door. Eleanor's voice came from the hallway. David? Sarah? I brought breakfast. Can I come in? The couple looked at each other. Both their faces were tear-stained, their eyes red. It was obvious that something serious had happened. 1 minute, Mom, David called out and quickly wiped his face. Sarah also tried to compose herself, but she knew that her mother-in-law's sharp eyes would notice the traces of tears anyway. When Eleanor entered with the tray, her gaze darted between her son and daughter-in-law. She placed the tray on the dresser and crossed her arms over her chest. What's going on? Nothing much, Mom. Just a family discussion. Don't lie to me, David. You could be heard all the way down the street. Eleanor moved closer. And don't tell me it's nothing special when you both look like that. David and Sarah remained silent. Finally, Eleanor turned to her daughter-in-law. Sarah, what have you done? Mom, don't, David began. No, let her answer. What have you been hiding from my son? Sarah raised her head and looked straight into her mother-in-law's eyes. There was no fear in her gaze anymore, only exhaustion and a strange determination. I worked at a clinic that performed abortions, she said calmly. For 3 years, I helped women terminate unwanted pregnancies. Eleanor paled and grabbed the back of the chair. Dear God, she whispered. David, did you know about this? I just found out. Eleanor turned to Sarah with an expression of cold fury. You lied to all of us. You pretended to be a Christian, married a pastor, and you're a murderer. Eleanor, I understand that this is shocking. Shocking? Eleanor moved closer. Shocking is an understatement. You destroyed my son's life, his ministry, his reputation. What will happen when people find out? No one will find out if we don't. Someone already knows, David interrupted. That Jessica is calling, threatening us. How many more like her are there? Sarah closed her eyes. I don't know. Possibly quite a few. Eleanor sank into a chair. My God, what are we going to do now? The next few hours were spent in difficult conversations. Sarah told them everything. About her work at Dr. Riley's clinic, about the women she had helped, about why she had left Baton Rouge. The Emily Tremblay story wasn't the only tragedy. There were other complications, other families who blamed the clinic for their losses. I moved here because I wanted to start a new life, she explained. I wanted to do good in a different way, to help people as a nurse, as a pastor's wife. You wanted to hide, Eleanor said coldly, to run away from the consequences of your actions. Yes, Sarah admitted. I wanted to hide, because I couldn't carry this burden anymore. David sat silently, asking questions occasionally. Each of Sarah's answers pushed him further away from her. By evening, it was clear that their marriage was hanging by a thread. I need time to think, he said finally. I need to pray, to figure out what to do next. David, I love you, Sarah whispered. That was never a lie. He looked at her for a long time. I loved you too. But I don't know who I loved. You or the woman you pretended to be. Eleanor stood up. I'm staying here tonight. We need to discuss how to deal with this situation. Sarah knew that this was not a suggestion, but a demand. Eleanor was going to take control of the situation, and Sarah knew that she was not part of her mother-in-law's plans. That night, David slept in the guest room while Sarah lay in their marital bed, staring at the ceiling. She could hear David and Eleanor talking quietly downstairs and knew they were deciding her fate. The truth had come out, but instead of relief, it brought only pain. Sarah realized that she had lost not only her husband, but also the only home she had ever known. Soon she would have to run again, but this time there would be nowhere to go. November covered St. Etienne with gray clouds and cold rain. The Hartwell home was filled with the atmosphere of a funeral wake. David and Sarah barely spoke, moving around the house like ghosts, avoiding eye contact. Eleanor practically moved in with them, taking on the role of supervisor and strategist. 3 days had passed since the revelation, and David was still restless. He spent hours in prayer, reading the scriptures, searching for answers in the words of preachers and theologians. But the more he thought about it, the stronger his revulsion toward Sarah's actions became. 100 children, he whispered, kneeling in his study. 100 innocent souls. On Thursday evening, Dr. Green arrived at the house. Eleanor let him in with obvious reluctance, but he insisted on speaking with David. Pastor, I should have told you earlier, the doctor began, taking off his coat in the hallway. But medical ethics? That doesn't matter now, David replied coldly. Now I know everything. They went into the living room, where Eleanor was sitting by the fireplace, knitting. Sarah was upstairs. She had hardly come downstairs in the last few days. Not everything, Pastor, Dr. Green said wearily, sinking into an armchair. Sarah is a good woman. She came to me when she moved to town and told me about her past. She asked for advice. Should she continue working in medicine after everything that had happened? And what did you tell her? Eleanor put down her knitting. I told her that everyone deserves a second chance, that her experience, painful as it was, could help her better understand the suffering of others. David clenched his fists. You knew she was a murderer, and you kept quiet? She's not a murderer, Dr. Green raised his voice. She's a nurse who helped women in the most difficult moments of their lives. Yes, some procedures ended tragically, but that doesn't make her a murderer. Abortion is the murder of an innocent child. David stood up and began pacing the room. No matter what the circumstances, life is sacred. And a mother's life isn't sacred? Dr. Green stood up as well. The life of a 14-year-old girl who was raped by her father? The life of a woman who will die if she tries to carry the child to term? God will find a way. God gave people minds and hands so they could help each other. Sometimes that help requires difficult decisions. Eleanor stood between the men. Dr. Green, with all due respect for your profession, you are speaking to a pastor. Our faith has clear principles. And are forgiveness and mercy among those principles? The doctor looked at David. Sarah is suffering for what she did. She has been tormented by guilt for 3 years. Isn't that punishment? Not enough, David said quietly. Dr. Green shook his head and headed for the door. Then, Pastor, I'm afraid you're not the man I thought you were. After he left, David stood at the window for a long time, watching the doctor get into his car and drive away. Eleanor approached her son. He doesn't understand, David. To him, it's just a medical procedure. He doesn't see the spiritual side of it. I see it too clearly. David turned to his mother. Mom, what should I do? I love her, but I can't live with what she's done. I can't preach about the sanctity of life knowing that my wife... Then you know the answer. Eleanor took her son's hand. Your ministry is more important. Your calling from God is more important than earthly love. On Friday morning, Sarah finally came down to breakfast. She looked haggard and had lost weight. Her eyes were red from sleepless nights. We need to talk, she said, sitting down at the table across from her husband. David didn't look up from the newspaper. About what? About our future. About what's going to happen. Eleanor, who was cooking eggs on the stove, tensed, listening to the conversation. I know you hate me, Sarah continued. I know I can't stay here, but I want you to understand that I never meant to hurt you. But you did. David finally looked at her. You destroyed everything I believed in. I tried to be better. I tried to make up for my mistakes. You can't make up for murder, Sarah, especially the murder of 100 innocent children. Sarah flinched but continued. I'll leave. Today. I'll file for divorce, and you can tell the community whatever you want. That I cheated on you, that I had another family, whatever. Where will you go? I don't know. I'll find another city, another job. I'll live with my sin like I've lived all these years. Eleanor placed the plate on the table with such force that the dishes clattered. And you think you can just walk away from the consequences? She said, turning to her daughter-in-law. What about Jessica Tremblay? What about the other families who might come forward? You think they'll leave you alone if you just drive away? I don't know, Sarah said, lowering her head. But I can't ruin David's life anymore. You already have, David said coldly. The only question is how to minimize the damage. At that moment, the phone rang. All three froze. Jessica's calls had become daily, and each time they brought new threats. David picked up the phone. Hello? Pastor Hartwell? This is Sheriff Howard from the county. I need to talk to you and your wife. Can I come over? David felt a chill run down his spine. What's going on, Sheriff? We'd better talk in person. I'll be there in half an hour. When David hung up, Sarah was as white as a sheet. Is this because of me? She whispered. Most likely. Eleanor sat down at the table. What could they have told the police? Jessica. Sarah covered her face with her hands. She promised she wouldn't leave me alone. Half an hour passed in painful silence. When Sheriff Howard arrived, an elderly man with a gray mustache and tired eyes, he was serious and formal. I've received a complaint about Mrs. Hartwell, he said, sitting in the living room. A woman from Baton Rouge claims that your wife was involved in the death of her daughter. That's not true, David said, though the words came out with difficulty. Perhaps, but I need to investigate. Mrs. Hartwell, did you work at Dr. Riley's clinic in Baton Rouge? Sarah nodded. And were you involved in the medical procedures that led to Emily Tremblay's death? I was there when the complications arose, but I am not responsible for her death. The sheriff wrote in his notebook. I'll need to review the medical records and talk to your colleagues in Baton Rouge. This is only a preliminary investigation, but I must ask you not to leave town. After the sheriff left, a dead silence fell over the house. Everyone understood that the situation was out of control. Now everyone will know, said Eleanor. The whole community will know that the pastor's wife... Mom, stop it! David stood up and walked over to the window. Stop what? Telling the truth? Your career is over, David. No one will allow a pastor with a murderous wife to serve in the church. I said stop. Sarah quietly got up and walked toward the stairs. Where are you going? David asked. I'm packing. Despite what the sheriff said, I have to leave. The longer I stay here, the more damage I'll cause. No, David said suddenly. You're not going anywhere. Sarah stopped. What? You're staying here. We'll sort this out. Eleanor looked at her son in surprise. "David, what are you doing?" "I said we'll sort this out," he repeated more sharply. "Sarah is my wife, and I won't let her run away and leave me to deal with the consequences." On Saturday evening, when Eleanor had gone home and only David and Sarah were left in the house, the last conversation of their marriage took place. "Do you really want me to stay?" Sarah asked, standing in the doorway of the living room. David sat in an armchair, staring into the fire. "I don't know what I want." "Then tell me what you don't want." He was silent for a long time, then said, "I don't want my ministry to end because of your sins." "And what do you suggest?" David turned to her. There was something new in his eyes, a cold determination that frightened Sarah more than anger. "You're going to get sick," he said calmly. "Seriously sick. And you'll die of that sickness before this ever comes to trial." Sarah didn't immediately understand the meaning of his words. "What?" "You will die like my beloved wife, whom I lost to illness. The community will mourn with me. My ministry will not only be preserved, but strengthened. A pastor who has lost his wife evokes sympathy." "David, I'm talking about solving the problem." He stood up and approached her. "You said you wanted to atone for your sins. Here's your chance." Sarah backed away toward the wall. "You're out of your mind." "No. I just realized that God has given me a sign. Your death will save my ministry and punish you for your crimes." "David, that's murder." "It's justice." He grabbed her by the shoulders. "You killed 100 children, Sarah. Your life is a fair price." Sarah tried to break free, but David was stronger. His hands tightened around her neck. "Please," she gasped. "David, please! The Lord is my shepherd," he began to whisper, squeezing tighter. "I shall not want." Sarah scratched his hands, trying to scream, but no sound came out of her constricted throat. Her lungs burned from the lack of air. "He makes me lie down in green pastures," David continued, his voice strangely calm. "He leads me beside quiet waters." Sarah's eyes began to darken. She saw her husband's face above her, the face of a man who believed himself to be an instrument of God's justice. "He restores my soul," he whispered. "He guides me in the paths of righteousness." Sarah stopped resisting. Her arms fell limply at her sides. David squeezed harder, completing what he considered his sacred duty. "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death," his voice trembled now, "I will fear no evil, for you are with me." When it was over, David gently laid his wife's body on the sofa. Her eyes were open, but there was no life in them. He closed them, kissed her forehead, and sat down beside her. For several minutes, he just sat there in silence, looking at the woman he loved and had killed. Then he got up and went to the phone. "Ambulance? My wife is not well. I think she's having a heart attack. Please hurry." When the medics arrived, David met them at the door, in tears. "I found her unconscious," he sobbed. "She complained of chest pains and then collapsed." The paramedics tried to resuscitate Sarah, but it was too late. Dr. Green, who arrived shortly after, pronounced her dead of heart failure. "She was so young," he said, looking at the body, "although she seemed very stressed lately." "Stress," David nodded through his tears. "She was very worried about various things." No one suspected anything was wrong. A young woman died of a heart attack. Rare, but it happens, especially considering the stress she had clearly been under lately. When the house was empty, David was left alone with what he had done. He stood in the living room where he had killed his wife an hour ago and felt a strange calm. "Justice has been served," he whispered into the emptiness. "The Lord has rewarded everyone according to their deeds." But deep inside, in the part of his soul he tried to silence, another voice whispered. A voice that said he had just done the same thing he had accused Sarah of doing, taking a life. David fell to his knees and began to pray, asking forgiveness for what he believed was right, and thanking God for the strength to do what he believed was necessary. Sarah Hartwell's funeral was one of the saddest events in the history of St. Etienne. The entire community gathered at Grace Church to say their final goodbyes to the young pastor's wife, who had died so suddenly of a heart attack. White lilies filled the altar, and the mournful faces of the parishioners reflected their sincere sympathy for their spiritual mentor. David stood by the coffin in a black suit, accepting condolences. His face expressed deep grief, and many noted how much he had aged in those few days. Eleanor stood close to her son, supporting him and taking on some of the community's grief. "So young, so good," whispered Mrs. Bourdier, squeezing the pastor's hand. "The Lord took her too soon." "She was an angel," added Mrs. Tremblay, "always ready to help." David nodded, accepting the words of comfort, but inside he was torn by conflicting emotions. On the one hand, he felt satisfaction that justice had prevailed. On the other, the image of Sarah dying in his arms haunted him every night. Dr. Green approached the coffin at the end of the ceremony. He looked at Sarah's face for a long time, then turned to David. "Pastor, may I speak with you after the service?" "Of course, Doctor." After the coffin had been lowered into the ground in the churchyard and the last of the congregation had left, Dr. Green remained with David at the fresh grave. "You know, Pastor, I've been a doctor for many years," he began, looking at the wreaths and flowers. "And something about Sarah's death bothers me." David tensed, but tried to remain calm. "What exactly?" "A heart attack at her age is extremely rare, especially without any predisposing factors." "But you said yourself that she had been under a lot of stress lately." "Yes, but—" Dr. Green paused. "There were small hemorrhages on her neck. I noticed them during the examination." David's heart began to race. "And what does that mean?" "Usually, such marks appear when the neck is compressed, but I thought it might be from the resuscitation efforts." "That's probably the case." Dr. Green looked intently at the pastor. "Pastor, if something happened, if there were circumstances you couldn't discuss, you know you can trust me?" "Doctor, I don't understand what you're talking about." "I see." Michael Green sighed. "But I won't press you. Sarah is dead and nothing will bring her back." He turned and walked toward the cemetery exit, leaving David alone at his wife's grave. Over the next few weeks, life in Saint Etienne gradually returned to normal. David continued to conduct services, his sermons becoming even more emotional and profound. Many parishioners noted that grief had made their pastor wiser and more compassionate. "He understands now what loss means," said Mrs. Landry. "His words about grief and hope have a special ring to them." Eleanor was pleased with how things were turning out. Her son's reputation had not only remained intact, but had been strengthened. The community saw him as a model of Christian humility in the face of God's will. But a month after the funeral, Detective Howard from the county police arrived in Saint Etienne, a man in his 40s with piercing eyes and methodical manners. He introduced himself as a specialist in particularly difficult cases, sent to complete the investigation begun by the sheriff. "Mr. Hartwell, I understand this is a difficult time for you," he said, sitting in the pastor's living room. "But I need to ask you a few questions about your late wife." "Of course, Detective. How can I help you?" "Did you know about your wife's past? That she worked at a reproductive health clinic?" David paused, as if considering his answer. "Yes. I found out shortly before she died. It was a shock." "How did you react to the news?" "I was upset, of course. But we were husband and wife. I wanted to understand her position, to find a way to forgive her." Detective Howard wrote in his notebook, "Mrs. Tremblay claims that she called you several times, threatening to expose your wife's past. Is that true?" "Yes, she called, but I didn't take it as a threat, more as an expression of grief from a mother who had lost a daughter." "And how did your wife react to these calls?" "Sarah was very upset. The death of that girl hit her hard, even though she wasn't to blame." The detective looked up from his notebook. "How do you know she wasn't to blame?" David realized he had said too much. "Well, I mean, medical mistakes happen. Sarah was a nurse, not a doctor." "Yes, but she was directly involved in the procedure." Detective Howard stood up and walked over to the window. "Mr. Hartwell, your wife died at a very convenient time for her." "What do you mean?" "The investigation could have led to a criminal case, possible charges of malpractice or even criminal negligence. Her death effectively closed the case. Detective, are you implying something?" Howard turned to the pastor. "I'm just pointing out a coincidence. But there's another point. Dr. Green shared his doubts with me about the cause of your wife's death." David felt his mouth go dry. "What doubts?" "Some of the physical evidence is inconsistent with a heart attack. Dr. Green insists on exhuming the body for a more thorough examination. "This is sacrilege." David stood up. "My wife is dead. She's at peace. What right do you have to disturb her remains?" "The right given to me by law, Mr. Hartwell, especially when there is suspicion of foul play." "Suspicion? Based on what?" Detective Howard took several photographs out of his pocket. "These were taken by Dr. Green during his examination of the body. Do you see these marks on her neck?" David looked at the photos and felt his legs go weak. There were clear, dark marks on Sarah's neck, symmetrically placed on both sides. That could have happened during resuscitation? Unlikely. The pattern of the bruising is consistent with manual compression. "Someone strangled your wife, Mr. Hartwell." David sank into a chair. "That's impossible. Who could have done such a thing?" "Good question. Who had access to your home on the night of the murder? Who knew about your wife's problems? Who would have benefited from her death?" "Are you suspecting me?" David tried to look indignant. "I'm just gathering facts for now. But tomorrow we'll conduct an exhumation. Modern investigative techniques will allow us to determine the exact cause of death." After the detective left, David spent the night in agonizing reflection. He knew that the exhumation would reveal the true cause of Sarah's death, and then everything would collapse. His ministry, his reputation, his freedom. In the morning, he called his mother. "Mom, I need to tell you something." Eleanor arrived half an hour later and found her son in a state of near panic. "David, what's going on?" "They know, Mom. The detective knows Sarah didn't die of a heart attack." "What are you talking about?" David took a deep breath. "I killed her, Mom. I strangled Sarah." Eleanor froze, then slowly sank into a chair. "What did you say?" "I couldn't live with what she did. All those murders. She would have ruined my ministry, my life. I did what I had to do." Eleanor was silent for a long time, studying her son's face. "And you think that justifies murder?" "It was justice, Mom. God's justice." "God's justice?" Eleanor stood up and walked over to her son. "David, you killed an innocent woman." "She wasn't innocent. She killed 100 children. She was a nurse who helped women in difficult situations. And even if she was guilty of something, you had no right to judge her." David looked at his mother in surprise. "Are you defending her?" "I'm defending what's right. You committed murder, David. You've become the very thing you condemned." "No, I did God's will. God didn't tell you to kill your wife." Eleanor grabbed her son by the shoulders. "You killed out of selfishness, out of a desire to save your reputation." At that moment, there was a knock at the door. Eleanor and David looked at each other. "It's them," David whispered. Eleanor went to open the door. Detective Howard and 2 police officers were standing on the doorstep. "Mrs. Hartwell, we'd like to talk to your son." "He's home. Come in." The detective entered the living room where David was sitting. "Mr. Hartwell, the preliminary autopsy results confirm our suspicions. Your wife died of asphyxiation as a result of strangulation." David remained silent. "We have reason to believe that you know more than you've told us. We'd like to invite you to the station to make a statement. Is this an official invitation?" "For now, but that may change." David looked at his mother, then at the detective. There was a strange calmness in his eyes. "Detective, what if I tell you that I know who killed my wife?" Howard was alert. "We're listening." "I killed her." The silence in the room was deafening. Eleanor covered her face with her hands, and the police officers instinctively moved closer to David. "Mr. Hartwell, are you sure about what you're saying?" "Absolutely sure. I killed Sarah on Saturday night. I strangled her with my bare hands." "Why?" David stood up and walked over to the window, looking at the church where he had served for the last few years. "Because she was a murderer. Because she lied to me from the day we met. Because she would have destroyed everything I believed in and lived for." "And you consider that justification for murder?" David turned to the detective. "I consider it God's will." Detective Howard nodded to the police officers. "David Hartwell, you are under arrest on suspicion of murder. You have the right to remain silent." As the detective read the rights, David stood calmly, as if the words were meant for someone else. Eleanor was crying, but he paid no attention to her. When they handcuffed him, he turned to his mother. Mom, hire a good lawyer, but not to deny my guilt, to explain to the jury that sometimes murder can be justified. David, please. I did what I had to do, and if I had to do it again, I would do the same thing. He was led away, and Eleanor was left alone in the house that, just an hour ago, had been a symbol of her son's successful ministry, and now was a crime scene. The trial of David Hartwell became a sensation not only in Saint Etienne, but throughout Louisiana. A pastor who killed his wife because of her past. Such stories attract the attention of the media and the public. David did not deny his guilt, but insisted that his actions were morally justified. His lawyer tried to present the case as a crime of passion, but David himself rejected this line of defense. I did not kill in a fit of rage, he declared in court. I made a calculated decision. My wife was a murderer and justice demanded punishment. The prosecutor easily proved that the murder was premeditated. Dr. Green's testimony, the results of the forensic examination, and David's own confession all pointed to the fact that he had killed his wife in cold blood. The jury did not deliberate for long. The verdict was unanimous, guilty of first-degree murder. The judge sentenced David Hartwell to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Mr. Hartwell, said the judge as he handed down the sentence, you were a pastor, a man who was supposed to bring love and forgiveness to people. Instead, you became a judge and an executioner. Your actions are incompatible not only with the law, but with the values you preached. David was led away in handcuffs. Eleanor sat in the public gallery, aged by the months she had spent there. Next to her were some of the Grace Church parishioners who had believed in their pastor's innocence until the very end. In prison, David showed no remorse. He spent his time reading the Bible, finding confirmation of his righteousness. The Old Testament stories of God's wrath and just retribution strengthened his belief that he had done the right thing. Eleanor visited him once a month. Each time she tried to get through to her son to make him admit his mistake. David, Sarah was your wife. You loved her. I loved an illusion, a woman who didn't really exist. She existed. She was a real person with a past, with pain, with mistakes, just like all of us. She was a murderer. And who are you? David looked at his mother through the glass of the visiting room. I am an instrument of God's justice. Eleanor no longer tried to change his mind. She understood that her son had gone so far in his beliefs that there was no turning back. The community in Saint Etienne fell apart. The Grace Church closed. No one wanted to pray in a place where a murderer had served. Some parishioners moved to other churches, others left the faith altogether. Dr. Green continued to work at his clinic, but he often thought about Sarah. He regretted that he had not been able to protect her, that he had not been able to foresee how far her husband's fanaticism would go. Jessica Tremblay, upon learning of Sarah's death and David's arrest, felt a strange emptiness. The revenge she had so desired had turned into a tragedy that brought no relief to anyone. The story of the murderous pastor became a warning about how religious fanaticism can turn love into hate and faith into a weapon of murder. In Saint Etienne, people remembered for a long time what happens when a person begins to consider himself a judge and executioner in the name of God.